Hello and welcome. Joining me here in the studio, Taib Ali, partner in Bindmans. He was shortlisted as Human Rights Lawyer of the Year in the Law Society's Excellence Awards and nominated as Criminal Defense Lawyer of the Year by the Society of Asian Lawyers. He has been twice featured at the Time Lawyer of the Week. In 2023, Taib was highly commended for Lawyer of the Year at the Modern Law Awards. Welcome to the show, Taib. Thank you for joining me today. So this week marks the 10th anniversary of the Rāb'a massacre, so 10 years since the massacre. Why has justice been absent until now?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. But I don't think what we've been trying to do, or what we had tried to do when we started our work all the way back, actually before the Rāb'a massacre, because we saw what was going to happen, we saw what was happening in Egypt with the coup process. It was less an attempt to get justice at the time. It was more of an attempt to prevent serious harm and criminal acts. And the question perhaps should have been, did we prevent the General Sisi's regime, now President Sisi, in being free to kill Egyptians, kill their own people on the streets of Egypt? And I think what I'd say is that the legal action that we took at the time, which we can go through in a moment, really did assist in slowing down the military's aggression and acts with regards to Egyptian protesters that were largely unarmed on the streets. I think that was phase one, and that was an important phase. And lots of legal action had to be taken in order to just make that happen, to slow down the aggression. I think if we hadn't have intervened in the way that we did at the time, significantly more people would have been arrested and killed and harmed during that period. Phase two is justice, and justice doesn't have a time limit on it. I think we're still engaged in that process now. And
10 years is too long for achieving justice in Egypt?
I mean, is 10 years too long? A day is too long to achieve justice. When somebody's rights have been violated to the degree where they've been injured to a life-changing degree, or killed, or have a family member killed, that person wants immediate justice. And in a perfect world, where justice is at the front of everybody's mind, then justice can happen very quickly. It can happen in the most unbelievably difficult circumstances. The best example of that we have right in front of us right now in the Ukraine, for example. We have war criminal prosecutions and convictions in the middle of a war in the Ukraine with Russia. So where there is the will of the international community, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Europe, justice can be instantaneous. It can happen before the events have even finished. And that's what indicates how rapid justice happens in a situation like this. And if you apply that same will to Egypt, then you could have justice today, tomorrow. We should have had it in 2013, 2014. So,
and you just said you tried and you worked hard to prevent the violation of human rights and the crimes from the Egyptian regime. Over 10 years, you have been a part of a legal team to persecute symbols of the Sisi regime. You submit complaints to the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, the African Union, the Universal Jurisdiction in Britain. You have several attempts to bring justice to Egyptian. And what I found interesting, you start this from the day one of the military coup. Your article in The Guardian is stated and published on the day of the massacre, 14th of August 2013. You stated and explain what happened in the National Guard massacre on the 8th of July.
Yes.
And in the 27th of July, another massacre. More than 150 people being killed. So tell us more about your journey towards achieving justice for Egyptians.
Yeah, I mean, so just as a lawyer looking at what was happening in Egypt, it became very clear before the Rāb'a massacre that the Egyptian military regime, was thinking very carefully about what it would do. And there were really clear signals to us here in the UK as a legal team that violence was going to be used. There were indications about that. And we thought it was really important that the perpetrators of that potential violence, but you see, violence can be proportionate. to quell the situation. But the signifiers and the signals we were seeing were showing that the violence was going to be disproportionate. It was what was happening on the ground with protesters, with Egyptians, was not responded to by the Egyptian military in a proportionate way. And so a senior British lawyer, Michael Mansfield, QC at the time, who's now a Casey, and myself, we decided that it was really important to bring to the attention of the world, and in particular the Egyptian regime, before they did anything, that there would be consequences to them if they did an action. And, you know, very unfortunately, but it also shows how we analysed the situation at the time. We together penned an article in for The Guardian, which was published on the day, on the 14th, which explained what we thought was going to happen and that this wouldn't just be allowed to be forgotten. And the fact that we're sitting here 10 years after that article talking about it kind of proves that we haven't forgotten about it. And so that's what led up to that point. And, you know, in a way, you know, it's quite a historic article in itself because it preempted what the Egyptian regime were going to do. But it's also very sad that we could see it. And it's even worse. And it's a sign of injustice that the international community clearly have analysts who are paid and extremely highly skilled, but they didn't see it, or they saw it and they refused to do anything about it. Because if I could see it sitting in my office in London, I'm sure the British government, the American government, and the European Union governments could see it as well. And they ignored it. And it shouldn't really be lawyers in London that have their own private practices to be warning foreign dictators and foreign military leaders about how to engage with their own people. It shouldn't be us. It should be other governments doing that. That's the whole point of the United Nations. That's the whole point of having the European Union as a collective. That's the whole point of having the United States at the time claiming to be the world's police force, you know, but there has to be some follow through in that. So what did we? Your question was, what did we do about this? Well,
you almost knocked all the doors, type the ICC, the
it's
UN,
important.
Every single door to achieve justice.
There wasn't a diplomat, a government, a prime minister, legal political institution in the whole of the Western world whose door we didn't knock.
Yeah.
So, but what's really important is you have to understand is we did not have time to allow foreign states to work out whether or not they were going to put human life as a priority or their economic interest as a priority. When we saw things like David Cameron travelling to meet the leader of a coup, General Sisi, in Egypt, rather than making public statements to him about the things that he was doing on the ground with his political cabinet at the time, that was really worrying because that's not what should be happening. You see now in a different situation in today's day, you've got the whole shift in geopolitics with Russia and the BRIC states.
Yep.
And you have Niger, for example, currently going through a coup, and all of a sudden there's outrage about this coup, and you've got the whole of the Western world saying, oh, hang on a minute, this is not right, we don't agree with coups. Well, where was that outrage 10 years ago? It wasn't in existence. And so what we were seeing happening back then was we were seeing that the British government, I mean, I'll talk about the British government, but it applies to other governments in the West as well, were putting economic interests first. I mean, this is a really important thing. They're putting economic interests before human life. Not even, I mean, there's one thing to say, look, don't have a coup and let's reverse it and put the democratic president back in place. That's one thing, right? And there's another thing, which is the very least they could do, which says if you use violence, we'll hold you accountable for it. If you use disproportionate violence, we'll hold you accountable for it. If you engage in crimes against humanity or war crimes, we'll hold you accountable for it. There wasn't even that. And so what we did was I put together a very significant and credible, high-profile legal team, which was led by Lord Ken MacDonald, who was the former Director of Public Prosecutions in the UK, who I work with quite a lot on human rights issues. And we put together an investigative team to look at what was happening in Rابعة as it was happening, not to wait a year or 10 years later. And we came to a very rapid conclusion that what the military regime, along with the political cabinet that was in place after they had arrested and detained President Sisi and his government.
Morsi, President Morsi.
President Morsi and his cabinet. Once they had done that, we established that the Egyptian military regime, President Sisi, General Sisi, was engaged in crimes against humanity. And that was something that was very clear to us. Now, you'll see that Human Rights Watch issued a plan 12 months after. It was the report was called According to Plan. And in that, they make it very clear that a crime against humanity was occurring, and the reaction by the military regime was massively disproportionate. They took violent action against unarmed protesters. They even in their report recorded that the amount of violence from the protesters, which was very minimal. They recorded statements from the government saying that recording the amount of weapons, for example, that were found by the protesters, which was something like 7 or something like this, right? Compared to the reaction of the army. Now, even on the most basic level, if you give all benefit of doubt to the military action, that's just simply disproportionate, right? It's a failure in policing, if you like, right? So that's the best case scenario that you could give to them. But what we saw was much, much worse than that. It wasn't a failure in policing. It wasn't just disproportionate action. It was actually a criminal act, an international criminal act. It was a crime against humanity. Now, some elements of crimes against humanity are punishable or prosecutable in any country of the world because they're seen as such bad acts that any state should be able to prosecute the perpetrators and protect the victims of that. And within crimes against humanity, one of the crimes that the military regime were actively engaged in was torture. In fact, the very action that they took against the civilians in the street fit into the definition of torture in international context, because what they were doing was they were punishing protesters to prevent other people from protesting, and that fits in with the definition of torture. Torture is something which is prosecutable under universal jurisdiction. So what we did, and it was really important because President Morsi's entire government was in detention, so they couldn't do anything about it, is we needed to bring the complaint. We needed to slow down what Sisi was doing on the ground in Egypt. And so how would you do that? If the British government is going there to discuss trade deals in the future and ignoring these crimes, if the American government is turning a blind eye to the coup, if the African Union, who complains perpetually about how Western institutions such as the ICC are always prosecuting Africans, can't even deal with African issues when they happen in Africa, then what do you do about that?
You had a legal round with the African Union as well.
We'll talk about that in terms of the death penalties. But if even they can't intervene in their own business, right, appropriately and rapidly and effectively, then you've got to take the issue elsewhere. And so what we did was we lodged a complaint really early on. First of all, we made the conclusion with Lord MacDonald and our legal experts that crimes against humanity were occurring on the ground in Egypt at that time. This is really important. So then we had to explain to the Egyptian government that we would hold them accountable for this. Now, how would you do that in a situation like this? So the first task we had to do was to bring the complaint outside of Egypt, outside of Africa, because of whatever political reasons and locally, nothing was happening, nothing effective was happening. So we took it and lodged it to the ICC. And you'll know that at the time, Egypt was not party to the Rome Statute, so it wasn't part of the ICC. So we had to work out how we could do that. And unfortunately, anybody with the actual authority at the time was stuck in prison in Egypt. So you couldn't sign what's called an Article 12.3 declaration bringing Egypt under the jurisdiction of the ICC. But what I had at the time, and I can explain this, and I think it's not publicly known, but I'm sure the Egyptian government knows because it was engaged in the process with the ICC at the time, is that we gained an authority for me to sign a document which we lodged at the International Criminal Court. On that moment in time, we had a issue, some conflict between the de facto now Egyptian government, which was Sisi's regime, and the de jure, the legal government, which was in prison. And as the lawyer for the lawful government, we signed an Article 12. Now, that was a really important step. It was a monumental step, a historic step, actually, because what it meant that the ICC now had to deal with the difference between a legal government and a de facto government, a coup government, which was what they referred to Sisi's regime as. So the ICC accepted it was a coup government. The question for the ICC was how far would that take the investigation? Okay, and that ended up being a long-term legal argument. But what was really important at that time is the Egyptian government then had to engage with the ICC. And suddenly, while they were massacring Egyptians, arresting Egyptians, torturing Egyptians on the ground, by the way, some of these Egyptians that they were torturing on the ground were my investigators. We'd given documents to gather evidence. They were being picked up by police officers on the ground in Egypt and then being tortured, asked questions about why they had my law firm's documents on them. But they were gathering evidence. They were doing proper legal work. So this is really important. So what does Egypt have at this moment in time? It has a situation where the ICC is saying, oh, actually, even though you've prevented the legal Egyptian government from signing the declaration, we've now got authority to look at this. So Egyptian generals, Sisi himself, no doubt, plus the civilian political cabinet at the time, are now worried for the first time. Okay, this is very quickly, it's around November 2013. They're worried that the ICC is thinking about actually investigating and prosecuting. So they can't continue their aggression in the same way, right? And it did you could see it immediately slow down action on the ground by the military regime. And so when you say to me, justice, and I say to you, well, actually it was about prevention of the crimes, it was working. And we know that it was working because we know how seriously Egypt took this, because while we were arguing with the ICC about opening an examination and investigation, Egypt was also lobbying the ICC, saying, don't open an investigation. But of course, Egypt had to be very careful at that point because, the regime in Egypt had to be very careful at that point because they didn't know which way the argument was going to go.
Okay, the media regime, the media outlet loyal to the Sisi regime may respond to what you have said that, okay, you did a great work, but you failed. You didn't reach any point. However, you were close to succeed. Tayyip, arresting symbols of Egyptian regime here in the UK. And this happened with Munir Fakhri Abdel-Noor, the former minister, in 2015. He cancelled his visit to Britain, and also with the former chief of staff, Mahmoud Hijazi, British Foreign Office guaranteed him a temporary diplomatic immunity. So how did you reach this point with both cases? Yeah,
so let's just park the ICC part. This is ongoing at this time. And so under the principles of universal jurisdiction, we developed a very, very strong legal argument. And it's really important because what people often think is that when things don't succeed, it's because of a lack of evidence. It wasn't because of a lack of evidence. The evidence that we had gathered was phenomenal, is phenomenal. We could show the people responsible for decision making. We could name them, which we did at the time. We could show how they were related to the military individuals on the ground that were firing bullets and guns and killing people, and how that related to the crimes against humanity and how that related to torture. So what we did was we opened files in the UK under the concept of universal jurisdiction, the principle of universal jurisdiction. And we lodged a complaint to Scotland Yard here. We named individuals. We named a significant number of individuals. I don't want to tell you who all the individuals are because those cases are still live as far as we're concerned. So and we'll talk about that
those
in a moment.
Cases are still
They're
live.
still live. Nothing has stopped in criminal law.
This is an important point.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. But and then so what we did is we engaged with the British police. Now, British police are quite phenomenal, actually. Okay, there is a specific war crimes unit. And they are genuinely interested in investigating and prosecuting crimes against humanity, elements that they have within the jurisdiction, obviously not the crime in itself, and war crimes. And there's a dedicated unit to dealing with this. And we found their engagement very, very useful and very, very cooperative. So we had a number of meetings with them and we engaged with them. And what we were doing in this process is on the law enforcement and justice achievement side, if you like to call it, was our legal team, our investigators, and the police and the Crown Prosecution Service here in the UK. And we had lodged documents with them, which they'd accepted, and they were moving the cases forward. Moving the cases forward meant that there's two ways to do this. One, we could have applied for a private arrest warrant. If there's not the will in the police to do the investigation and the arrest themselves, then we could apply for that arrest warrant privately. But we didn't need to do that in this situation because the police had accepted to open up an investigation file. They had accepted that crimes which were prosecutable in the UK had been committed by the two gentlemen that you've named, plus other people. And the rules are in the UK that if those individuals travel into our jurisdiction, the police then have an obligation to arrest them and prosecute them. And the safeguard to that is that we were also prepared to go to court and arrest them and prosecute them on a private level. And this is what the police tried to do, right, with both of them, right? But what happened was, for, again, putting economic interests before human life, the British government, Foreign Office, issued what's called a Special Mission Immunity Certificate to protect these individuals. And I need to explain how that works, because this was the only bar to us. Each time the police got to a certain stage where they wanted to do something, there was a hurdle put in their place by the British government or some other factor. What we would do as private individuals, we would then assist the police by taking the matter to the High Court. And each time we went to the High Court, we removed that barrier and the police were able to move to the next stage. And the level of cooperation between us and the police was quite good, right? I'd say it was quite good. I'd say to you there was a will in the police to prosecute these individuals. I'd put it at that level. So then what happened was we decided to challenge the Special Mission Immunity Certificates in the High Court. And we took it to the High Court. We then took it to the Court of Appeal. And we stopped short of the Supreme Court. We made a decision to wait. And what had happened is simply that the government had issued Special Mission Immunity Certificates because they said that these individuals had travelled here on political business. And this feeds back to your question about, is 10 years too long? Well, no, it's not, clearly, because what happens with individuals, Osama, is that you start off with a crime, and you start off with them having an interest in that criminal act, or the governments have an interest in protecting them from that, their own government and also foreign governments. But that doesn't last forever. Governments here change, governments there change, and these people's jobs change. And eventually they get into a position where they just become regular citizens with a political history. It's much harder for government to protect them at that point. Now, let me ask you this question. Let me ask you this rhetoric question. The people whose family members were killed, murdered, on the streets in Raqqa, is 10 years enough for them to have forgotten that? It's not.
Never.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And so it's not long enough for the protection that these people have to become stronger. It's weaker now, right? As long as these memories exist, as long as people have the will to want to prosecute these individuals.
So this is why you said this is an ongoing cases.
Yeah, it's
here.
an ongoing situation.
This case is...
Right now, it's an ongoing situation here. And what we're about to do or doing at the moment, I'm looking at doing, reviewing all the cases that we've had historically. We thought that this anniversary would be a good opportunity to just refresh everything. And we are going to look at the cases that we did, very many cases. I mean, we've just talked about a couple, right? And we are going to refresh the evidence in those cases. We're going to ensure that we know where the individuals are that were subject to the original complaints, and when they travel into the United Kingdom jurisdiction, possibly EU jurisdiction.
I will come shortly to the next step you can do, but back to your opinion piece in The Guardian. And the day of the massacre, you wrote, and I quote, "Persecution military leaders using the principle of universal jurisdiction can be difficult. But let it be a warning to the military leadership in Egypt. As recently as in January, police officers from Britain's Specialist Metropolitan Police unit targeting suspected war criminals and human rights abusers arrested and charged Nepalese Colonel Kumar Lama for human rights abuses committed in Nepal. Colonel Lama worked as a UN peacekeeper in South Sudan. During his arrest, he was visiting the UK on Christmas. And also, this happened with Rwanda ex-spy chief Pascal Simbikangwa, who was arrested in France in 2008 and charged to 25 years in prison in 2014 over the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. So why was this not the case with Egyptian officials?
Well, I mean, it's not been the case yet with Egyptian officials. I think that's the really important point here. You know, there's a saying, the wheels of justice turn slowly, right? And this is true. And you'll see in those cases that the criminal acts that they were accused of, particularly in one, was quite a long time before any action was taken. And what I'd say to you and to the military personnel and the civilian personnel that are involved in these acts is that it's not over. It's not over at all. If you've committed a crime, those sleepless nights that you have when you ordered your soldiers to murder your own citizens, or when you pointed your gun at your own citizens and shot them, you know, your brothers and sisters, your own people, when you did that, the sleepless nights you have because of that, because you have to have sleepless nights because of that. Every human being that I've ever spoken to in my criminal law practice regrets this type of thing when they think about it, and it affects them. That nightmare is not over. That nightmare, at the moment, you're safe, it's in your dreams, but at any moment in time, where you're traveling to a European country, the United States or the United Kingdom, it could result in actual physical prosecution, detention, investigation with regards to you individually. And what I find sometimes really interesting, a lot of the times, people wonder why there's a gap in this. So sometimes I get telephone calls from soldiers or members of their families or politicians that say to me, look, I did this thing many years ago. I can't live with it anymore. I have to tell somebody about it, right? And it's a way to get that sleep back again. You know, when you're having these nightmares, it's a way to purge yourself of your wrongdoing. Yeah. And so, you know, anybody involved in that massacre in Raqqa in all those many years ago, they're not safe. I mean, what I'd say to them...
What do you mean, Taib? Anybody who involved? This just including military staff, military chief and police officers and government in cabinet at time, or...?
Well, I mean, strictly speaking, we're talking about there's two types of criminal acts. There's a primary and a secondary, okay? So the people that we've been talking about so far are the primary actors, okay? So the primary offence, the person that actually shot the bullet, the person that actually gave the order. But then there's also a secondary group of people, and these are people that incite criminal acts, okay? Or procure or assist. Now, the Rome Statute's very clear. If you give material assistance to an individual committing a crime against humanity or war crime, you are equally responsible for that. Right? So if a tank is about to go commit a genocide in a village somewhere and they go to a petrol station and somebody puts diesel in the tank, knowing what the tank is going to go do, then they are equally responsible because they're giving material support to the tank. But if you verbally support the action of criminal acts or even encourage it and support it, that's a criminal offence, both in domestic Egyptian law, in British law and international law. And those people, so I mean, I'll explain one of the new files, if you like, that we're looking at. We had lots of reports back in when we originally started about journalists, for example, that were abusing their really important position as journalists to encourage the military to continue to crack down on unarmed civilian protesters, using the means that they were doing. They were encouraging it using quite wild remarks and statements. Now, I'm not going to name them today, but what I can say is that we are reinvestigating a number of those individuals in Egypt with a view to bringing prosecutions with regards to their role. And these are secondary offences such as incitement, procuring, assisting. And they're really important because the punishment is the same.
Because, you know, we experienced in Egypt at the time of the Raqqa massacre an awful media campaign. Hatred speech and incitements, kill these people and so on from journalists and TV anchor. And what's interesting, they are still working and still presenting their show every day now in Egypt without any persecution or any legal action. So let us bring what happened in Rwanda again. In 2003, two Rwandan journalists have been sentenced to life in prison, and a third to 35 years for their roles in fueling the 1994 genocide, in which 800,000 Tutsis and Hutus were murdered. The trial known as hate media. And this is a quite interesting type, because this is quite similar to what happened in Egypt 10 years ago. The International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda, which is being held in Tanzania, heard how the media played a major role in inciting extremists from the Hutu majority to carry out the 100-day slaughter of ethnic Tutsis and politically moderate Hutus. For example, phrases like "go to work and the graves are not yet full" were read by radio DJs during the spring of 1994. A newspaper called on citizens to exterminate the cockroach Tutsis. And we have been listening to similar incitement in Egypt, to be honest, with the same phrases at the time of Rابعة massacre. So what kind of legal action can be done?
Well, I want to talk about that. You were very generous just now by calling these people journalists, right? And I think I wouldn't necessarily do that. So I have legal cases in a number of countries currently, which is designed to protect journalistic freedom, where journalists themselves are targeted because of their reporting. Okay, now, what's the point? I mean, sorry, I know you're a journalist, and I don't mean to be teaching you what I think a journalist is, but journalism is very important. Reports are very important. What do they do in situations like during massacres and war crimes and crimes against humanity situations? Is their job to report what is actually happening on the ground in order to hold governments accountable. That's a cornerstone of any civilized and democratic society. Civilized and democratic, not just democratic society. Because
this is the job of journalists.
It's the job of journalists to hold the
situation in Egypt, they are turned into a mouthpiece for the regime.
This is precisely the point. So if your journalist is doing his job properly or her job properly, they will be saying about the people in power, not about the citizens on the ground, about the people in power. You are doing this wrong, you are violating law, I'm holding you accountable, and that's how they do it. What happens in countries like Egypt, unfortunately, is that the press become controlled by the government. And that's an indicator of a non-free society. And this is what we have in Egypt, it's not free. And so what happens is that instead of, in order for some journalists, in order to protect themselves and in order to ingratiate themselves with the regime, or just because they're instructed to do so, they will pump out propaganda and they will inflame the situation. And you'll often find that there is a direct communication channel between the government and the journalist, and they're just doing they're kind of, instead of preventing and holding them accountable, they're saying, oh, it's okay, we can go and do this, and we can murder people and we should do it more. And that's wrong. So I would, first of all, question whether those individuals should be even categorized as journalists, okay? They're just basically spokespeople for a military regime engaged in crimes. So therefore that makes, you can see now with that kind of a descriptor, less generous than yours, they're part of the problem. They're part of the operation apparatus that are committing the crime, and therefore they should be held accountable, and they can be. So there's a whole host of action. Yeah, there's a whole host of action. So the criminal acts that they've done, if they fall within if the criminal acts that they're supporting and inciting are crimes of universal jurisdiction, such as torture, crimes against humanity, genocide, these types of things, like in the Rwanda situation, then they're prosecutable under the principles of universal jurisdiction too. Okay, if the elements that they're supporting within the crime is like torture, for example, then they're prosecutable in the United Kingdom under universal jurisdiction. So they're equally responsible. The problem with, or the situation with Egypt is that nobody's really looked at these people yet. And I think it's time that we start looking at some of these people, particularly if they're still in the same position and hiding behind a shield of journalism, when in actual fact they're just...
When you say it's a time to look after these people and see what they have done at the time of the Rابعة massacre, what do you mean? There is a legal action can be taken against...
Yeah, so in the same way as we apply for arrest warrants, or we ask the police to investigate, the UK police, to investigate and prosecute individuals, we can do exactly the same thing with them. But there's even more than that, because if we present a bundle of evidence to the Home Secretary in the United Kingdom, the Home Secretary can take preemptive action with regards to these individuals and actually prevent them from entering the United Kingdom space. And once that process starts happening, that individual's ability to travel becomes restricted. So it's about building up that evidence bundle. It's about holding these people accountable. It's an important message to send to people, military regimes as well as their spokespeople, that this kind of behaviour is not something to be engaged with. Right now, the situation in the African continent is very unstable. There is a pressure between Russia and the West as to who owns what in that state. You know, it's time for people the West particularly, when they talk about international law and rule of law and their commitment to human rights, it's time to start demonstrating that, because that's the way that they will win favours in Africa and have regimes come to their side and support their side, is by holding people that commit these serious criminal acts accountable, by supporting countries in doing that properly.
So after 10 years now, to just conclude, you are pursuing the primary and secondary people involved in the Rابعة massacre.
So right now, we've got files we're opening with regards to this exact thing, yes.
Yeah, okay. And many people, even with the Rابعة victims, they are saying, okay, 10 years is too long and we will never achieve justice. Give us some example to similar countries have a similar massacre or human rights violation, and the people who committed this violence are being persecuted even after many years.
I mean, there are many examples. So first of all, this area of law and this area of sort of human rights prosecution is developing, and it's always developing. But we see it in Europe. We have the Kosovo, Bosnia, Serbia. We have war crimes tribunals with respect to that. We have war crimes tribunals in regards to Rwanda. We've got a really active ICC right now in the Ukraine. You named a couple of examples yourself in the United Kingdom. This is real, it happens, and it can happen at any given moment in time to any person. It's not fantasy and it's not fiction. And what we're finding, particularly in our new order that we have in Europe and Russia, we're finding that the elements where prosecutions are happening and accountability is happening is becoming stronger. Now, it's very difficult for you to, for the British government, for the international community to take action against Russia and prosecute Russian war criminals in the Ukraine and then ignore these other things around the world, because then the voice starts to rise, well, hang on a minute, there's war crimes happening in these countries too. And so what I'm predicting will happen going forward is that we'll get a strengthened regime of accountability for international crimes. I mean, even now, the United States has passed legislation, quite historic legislation, to fund the ICC in some of its war crimes investigations. I mean, this is phenomenal. The United States have historically, up until very recently, absolutely ignored the ICC. In fact, create legislation to attack it if necessary, right? And now it's changing. And so you'll see that regime become stronger and you'll see it spread. So there's real hope.
Regarding the hope, and finally, this is my final question, a famous saying says, if there is a will, there is a way. Do you believe this will be the case with the Rابعة massacre? Victims and people who admitted the violence and the massacre?
Yeah, I think where there's a will, there is a way. That's true. We have to put in our effort, and we have to make sure that we hold individuals accountable or try to hold them accountable. And that's the least that we can do, so least of our responsibility to the individuals that were the victims of these massacres. So I think it's a good way to sum it up. Where there's a will, there's a way. And I think as long as we put the effort in, we'll get the way.
Taib Ali, thank you very much for joining me today.
You're welcome, thank you.